Good evening. My name is Kelly Kipfer, and I'm the Manager of Community Engagement and Children's Services here at Waterloo Public Library. On behalf of the library and our incredible partners at Renison University College, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to this evening's event, Anti-Racism, the Urgency of Action. For tonight's discussion, registrants were invited to pre-submit questions to be posed to the panel. We invite you to submit any additional questions that you have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. These questions will be addressed as time permits during the Q&A portion of the evening. A recording of tonight's presentation will be available on the Renison website later this week. There will be a link sent to all attendees that will address any questions that aren't addressed during the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kofi Campbell, Vice President, Dean, and Academic of Renison University College.
Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to wait for our panelists to all appear. Come on in, panelists. In the meantime, welcome everyone, and it is our distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight as part of the One Sky Overall Community Speaker Series hosted by Renison University College and Waterloo Public Library. My name is Kofi Campbell, and I am the Vice President, Academic and Dean at Renison. We begin, as always at Renison, by acknowledging that our work is on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the neutral Arawanderen people. Our institution is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, teaching, community engagement, learning, community building, and outreach. And it is centralized within the Truth and Reconciliation Working Group and the University of Waterloo's Indigenous Initiatives Office. The phrase One Sky Overall, after which this series is named, is Renison's motto, and it really encompasses all that we are and all that we do. Renison believes very strongly in contributing to a world in which social justice, diversity, and equity are not merely aspirations, but realities. And we believe very deeply that institutions of higher learning have a responsibility to engage with the communities of which we are a part, and indeed, which support our very existence. Now, these two commitments are what bring us together here tonight as a community, to focus together on the important anti-racism work that is being done, and as importantly, on the work that still remains to be done, both in our institutions of higher education and in our wider communities. Now, for us at Renison, this work is not at all new, nor are these conversations. We have hosted a national anti-racism conference along with the University of Waterloo called Converse Action, which was aimed at fighting racism in our institutions of higher education. We are in the process of forming a national anti-racism committee, task force, which will be focused on higher education and which will necessarily engage with our wider communities, including, of course, all levels of government and industry as well. We are in the process of forming an anti-racism committee for Renison itself, which work is being led by Dr. Kathy Hogarth, whose voice has emerged as a very strong and vital one in these troubling times of ours. And we are committed to engaging in dialogue with our wider communities, to share our understanding and our experience, to build coalitions, to educate those who maybe have not been as engaged in this work, and most importantly, to continue to learn together how we can stand together to fight the scourge of racism, which is unfortunately all still too widespread. And this, of course, is the work which brings us together this evening. The Minister for Diversity and Inclusion in Youth, the Honourable Bardish Chagger, will be our moderator for this evening. And we are very grateful both for her presence here today and for her attention to this vital work. Before I turn the proceedings over to Minister Chagger, however, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists. I won't go into a great deal of detail. Their bios have been on the screen in the lead up, and we will invite them certainly to tell us a bit about themselves. So first, joining us from Calgary is Dr. Malinda Smith, who is the inaugural Vice-Provost for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. She is also the co-author of The Equity Myth, perhaps the most important work to date focusing on racism in the Canadian higher education landscape. Next, we have Dr. Jasmin Zine from one of our local institutions, Wilfrid Laurier University. Dr. Zine is one of the foremost experts on Islamophobia and a very highly sought after scholar in academic circles, in the media, and certainly among policymakers worldwide. It is also my distinct pleasure to welcome as well Dr. Jean Becker, who is currently the Associate Vice President of Human Rights, Equity and Inclusion at the University of Waterloo and the Senior Advisor to the President on Indigenous Initiatives. Jean is an Inuk member of the Nunatsiavut Territory of Labrador and also currently a member of the Mayor's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Task Force here in Kitchener. And she has, of course, a great deal of experience in doing this work. Ethan Candler, a University of Waterloo alumnus, was supposed to join us, but an emergency meant that he could not make it tonight. Ethan, please know that our thoughts are with you this evening. To the panelists, welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening for this very important conversation. And without further ado, I am pleased to turn proceedings over to our moderator, who needs absolutely no introduction, the Honourable Bardish Chagger. Minister Chagger, welcome.
Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for your great words and kicking us off this evening. It is absolutely fabulous to be here with you. So hello everyone, bonjour à tous. I want you to know that I'm joining you here in the city of Waterloo on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the land so that we know where we come from, to be able to clearly see where we are going. And without knowing our history, we cannot create the future that we all do desire. And I think it's important that we learn our true history. And part of the conversations that we have all been having is that most of us are not taught our true history, whether it's in our school systems, within our families or institutions. And that's why it's really important for myself to always acknowledge where I am situated and where, whose land I am speaking to you from. And I'm really glad to join you this evening for what I'm sure will be a constructive and meaningful conversation. I want to give acknowledgement to Dr. Kofi Campbell at Renison University, as well as the Waterloo Public Library, for bringing us this opportunity, because conversations remain important, but actions even more so. And I will say that sometimes acting is difficult, but I would rather act and be able to learn from those actions, course correct to ensure that we are acting rather than continue conversing. But conversations can never end, and that's why I'm really happy to be part of our conversation tonight, our discussion. Over the past few weeks and months, we have seen thousands of Canadians from coast to coast to coast take a stand against racism, discrimination, demanding change through calls of action. And even by digging deep into our own backyards and dissecting the spaces that each of us occupies. We have heard the daily experiences of Black Canadians, people of color, and Indigenous people who encounter racism, discrimination, and inequity every single day. We have witnessed the social and economic disparities that have been laid bare by the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on equity-seeking communities. In this cultural moment, many people are having an awakening about what is happening and what their role is in building a more inclusive, better, and stronger future for all. People are realizing that we must act. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said, we can't pretend that systemic racism doesn't exist in Canada. We know that it does. This is why we can't ignore the crucial importance of diversity and inclusion throughout society, including within our academic institutions. C'est pourquoi on ne peut pas ignorer l'importance de la diversité et de l'inclusion dans toute la société, y compris dans nos universités. Meaningful inclusion means being seen and being heard at every level. I often look around the table to see who isn't at the table, whose voices aren't being heard, who is seen and who is heard, who has space and who doesn't, whether on the boards, in administration, part of the faculty, or in student organizations, send signals. When diversity is lacking, we risk building Canadian institutions that exclude entire groups of people and perpetuate inequity. That's the very definition of systemic racism. Last year, students and administrators from 25 universities throughout Canada laid the groundwork for developing a sector-wide anti-racism task force to begin the work of addressing and eliminating systemic racism in the academy. And I want to commend Dr. Campbell and his leadership for this really important work. That was an encouraging start, yet it's important that we broaden this conversation as we are doing today to include the wider community. If we are going to succeed, it is crucial that we collaborate within and across all sectors to remove the barriers that still prevent many Canadians from contributing fully to our society. This includes government. And let me tell you that our commitment to diversity and inclusion, as well as tackling racism and discrimination, remains unwavering and absolute. Since recognizing the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent in 2018, we have recommitted to building a stronger Canada where all Canadians, including people of African descent, feel safe and included. Like the Sankofa bird, we believe in the importance of moving forward by reflecting on the past to build a truly inclusive society for all. In 2019, we launched Canada's anti-racism strategy, which includes the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which is working across government to tackle systemic racism. I want you to know tonight, we have Peter Flagel, head of the Anti-Racism Secretariat, listening in to this conversation. When COVID-19 hit, one of the first things that he did under his leadership and recognizing the importance of every single federal department and agency playing a role was to co-chair the COVID-19 Equity Seeking Communities Task Force. That's to ensure that every single decision that our government is making at the federal table recognizes the importance of these voices. As the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion in Youth, my responsibilities include working with all federal departments and agencies and ministers to ensure that every government decision is made with diversity and inclusion in mind. And I often say, if those voices aren't heard or represented at the decision-making table, at minimum, we must ensure that our decisions are informed by lived experiences. Each of us has a responsibility to reach out and open up those channels, because oftentimes we have people within our communities that do not feel like they belong. And that's part of our history that we need to dismantle and actually confront to ensure the way we move forward ensures that those voices are not only heard, but respected and listened to and engaged with so that we make better decisions. We know that there's a lot more work to do, and we are committed to doing that work as allies and partners with communities, businesses, organizations, and institutions. In fact, that's why all of us are here today. So we will get down to work. I will limit my comments as much as I can, and I really want to turn the floor over to the people who are participating. And before I do, I just want to say that I've spent some time getting to know your bios and getting to know that the work that each of our panelists do. And I've actually realized and seen that there are people who are waiting for change, and then there are people who not only empower, but enable change and create change. And that is what you have in front of yourselves tonight. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. So I will turn the floor over, first of all, to Jean, and then to Dr. Jasmin, and then to Dr. Malinda, to give a brief introduction to yourselves and to the work that you're doing before we get into our questions and answers and a little bit of debate and discussion. Over to you, Jean. A pleasure to see you again tonight.
Thank you so much, Bardish. It's a real pleasure to see you, and I feel so humbled to be in the company of such a distinguished panel. Thanks for including me today. So hello, everybody. I am a grandmother. I am Inuk. I'm proud to be a member of the urban Indigenous community in Waterloo and Wellington regions for the past 40 years or so. I started life in Nunatsiavut, Labrador, which actually Nunatsiavut didn't exist when I was born. I was part of a very large family, 9 children. I was schooled in a residential school. I left home when I was very young. I married, I had children, and late in life, almost 40, I found my way to university and had an intellectual awakening there. And I discovered the Indigenous history of Canada. And I think I had an experience in doing that that's quite common among the students that I work with today. I I went through 3 stages of grief, as I see them, associated with learning the history of Indigenous people in Canada. As I confronted the truths that I was learning, I went through a period where I was numb with anger. In that early part of my schooling, I was often disorganized. My thinking was jumbled. I felt like I couldn't string a sentence together. Schoolwork was torturous. And I went through a period where I felt there was no end to the pain and the loss that I was learning about. However, through my relationships in the Indigenous community in the region, through volunteering in the correctional institution with Indigenous prisoners, and especially through ceremony and working with elders, I slowly was able to reorganize myself. So since that time, my life is really centered around the community and the work that I do in the university to try and make the changes we need to see for Indigenous peoples, cultures, and Indigenous ways of knowing. I really work to see that Indigenous ways of knowing become respected and valued along with all other knowledges in higher education. And I know that Indigenous people and indigeneity add immense life and value to the institutions where we are present when we are embraced and given the space to flourish. And that's what I'm working on to achieve. That's it for me.
Elder Jean Becker, it's amazing to hear your voice and just to hear a little bit about yourself, just to hear, especially about grandmother. My grandparents are not here today, but everything they've taught me remains in my heart, and their teachings stay with us. And it's really important that we be able to connect to your story. And I thank you for having the courage to share it. Dr. Jasmin Zine, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be included in this conversation. I was not going to say much about myself, but Jean is always so inspiring. So I'm going to just say something as a preface, because as an academic, I've actually prepared a few notes that I wanted to share. So, but I will preface it with a bit of my own story. I came to Canada, let's see now, 53 years ago. I was 3 years old. I came from Pakistan with my parents, and we ended up in small town Ontario. We were the only Pakistani family that I ever saw. I actually never saw anyone who looked like me until I was well into university. And my route to getting to university was a strange one, because growing up, I experienced a lot of racism and harassment. So I ended up dropping out of high school, or rather being pushed out of high school at 16, and I never went back. So I literally have 4 credits from high school, even though I do have a PhD, but it took me a while to end up there. I ended up becoming a hairstylist and moving to Toronto in the 80s, when it was very cool to have like purple hair and be part of that scene. But it was also a way of distancing myself from an identity that I could not control, but one that was very much devalued, you know, in society. And then later I found my way to university as a mature student. That brought me to where I am today. And I think my own experiences in schooling and education inspired in me an interest in youth. And I've been researching Muslim youth in Canada since the late 1990s. So I wanted to actually talk a little bit about my research, if I can, for a few minutes. And I wanted to ensure that the conversation that we're going to have about anti-racism is an intersectional one. So I'm going to speak to Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. And I want to focus briefly on 3 points. First, why? I want to situate a backdrop landscape of Islamophobia in Canada that helps us understand why we need to still talk about Islamophobia, why we need to have these conversations. And secondly, So that's sort of the why. And then it's the who is to talk about the youth that are part of the research that I do, what I call the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth that I've been researching. And since Minister Chagger's portfolio covers youth, I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the findings on my national research study on Canadian Muslim youth that involved 130 youth participants across Canada. And then finally, what, and that is to talk about what is driving Islamophobia. And I'll briefly introduce the topic of the Islamophobia industry, which is the focus of my current research project. So just to briefly map a landscape of Islamophobia in Canada, there are some critical issues we need to examine that I think are not being addressed enough. And that is, number one, the Quebec Massacre, which took place 3 years ago, where 6 Muslim men were shot and killed by white nationalist terrorists during their evening prayers in a Quebec mosque. Another are the number of hate crimes that are happening against Muslim Canadians. Stats Canada found that hate crimes grew 253% from 2012 to 2015. And then if we look at Quebec, there have been unconstitutional policies like Bill 21 that target Muslim women's religious attire and seek to ban them from the public sphere. Also, the numbers in Canada in terms of the polls about public opinion about Muslims tell us a story, and I think that that's an important one that we can't overlook. For example, 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims, and 42% that feel that discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. 1 out of 4 Canadians would favor a ban on Muslim immigration to this country, 32% in Quebec. 57% of Quebecers and 51% of the rest of Canada feel the presence of Muslims in this country make them somewhat or very worried about security. And 43% of Canadians hold unfavorable views of Islam as compared to other faiths. 4 in 10 Canadians have expressed some level of bias or unfavorable feelings against identifiable racial groups, with Muslims having the highest negative rating. So in light of all these facts that argue for an urgent need to address Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, there has been unfortunately no tangible outcomes from Motion 103 that endorse the need to focus on Islamophobia nationally, as well as religious discrimination and systemic racism, and also to support research and programs to combat that. And out of the report that emerged from the parliamentary hearings and aided in the development of the National Anti-Racism Strategy, Islamophobia was very much, I think, sidelined in that. There's still no National Day of Remembrance for the Quebec Massacre, despite broad community-driven campaigns for such a commemoration. And in the report that I mentioned on the National Action Strategy, the parliamentary hearings that developed that action strategy, only 2 of those mention Islamophobia out of 30. And I think that is unacceptable. I want to switch just briefly to now talk about who, and for me that who is experiencing Islamophobia is specifically in the relation to my work, the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth in Canada. My current book focuses on how Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, and the war on terror has impacted their lives. The 9/11 attacks in the United States and subsequent global war on terror have created a landscape of violence that is the inheritance of young Muslims whose lives are being shaped within and against these crises. These youth who've come out of these turbulent times have a unique legacy, as they've not known a world before the aftermath and backlash surrounding these events. So the 9/11 generation has grown up under unique circumstances where their identities became reconfigured as radicals and jihadists, and they face racial, religious profiling, securitization, and surveillance. Unlike all Muslims, they get collapsed into a singular, abject, and undifferentiated category that erases the vast diversity and heterogeneity among 1/5 of the world's population. So there's actually a wide variety of registers through which Muslim youth live their lives, but they are currently reduced to the West's worst racial fears about them. And they have limited scope to create and counter dominant narratives that govern the distinctions between being seen as either peaceful citizens or dangerous suspects. Some youth have to deal with global forms of Islamophobia, like those in the Rohingya community in KW, whose families have fled ethnic cleansing and genocide, and yet those able to escape are subject to anti-Muslim racism in the West. Now, at the local university level, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism have manifested in curriculum bias, differential treatment, Islamophobic harassment, and surveillance by security forces. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what I'm able to share with you because of time. And finally, I want to talk about the what. So what is driving Islamophobia? And Islamophobia is a system of oppression that is unique in that there is an industry of interconnected individuals, organizations, media outlets, think tanks, and the donors that fund them that are dedicated to promoting and purveying anti-Muslim racism. This is a billion-dollar industry in the United States, and some of that funding has seeped into Canada to support organizations and individuals dedicated to spreading Islamophobic propaganda. I've been researching the Islamophobia industry of networked groups, and these include white nationalist groups. There are about 300 operating in Canada right now. My research team has been documenting almost 20 whose main focus is Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. Then there are what we call the soft power groups that use rhetoric like Judeo-Christian democracy, Canadian values, and the rule of law as proxy language for casting Muslims as dangerous foreigners who are Trojan horse plotting an Islamic takeover of Canada. As well as media outlets like Rebel Media that has launched the careers of Islamophobic ideologues like Ezra Levant, Faith Goldie, and Lauren Southern. Some politicians too have publicly espoused Islamophobic rhetoric that dog whistles to the Islamophobia industry and authorizes hate. Again, what I'm sharing now is just the tip of the iceberg of what we know and have documented about the Islamophobia industry, but I wanted to further demonstrate how this form of oppression is uniquely supported and funded. So in conclusion, I offer these remarks as a means of keeping all forms of oppression and racism on the table as we think forward toward action. Thank you.
Dr. Jasmin Zine, I've not had the opportunity to meet you in person. I'm going to have my team reach out to ask for us to connect because I want to actually build upon this work. And I will use the word courage again. We have to have the courage of our convictions to call these items out. And I think that's something that you did well, even when it came to the work of parliamentary committees, when it came to Motion 103. It was a very, I'll use the word disturbing time for the government when it came to that motion. And it was fascinating to hear not only what I heard as a member of Parliament for Waterloo, but even as the government of House leader at that time, because the House of Commons was utilizing Canada as the time of Canadians paid by Canadian taxpayers to have this important discussion and debate. And I think it's important the realities of people, of Muslim Canadians be shared. And I really do appreciate you being an academic and having some notes prepared. These areas that you've highlighted are essential ones and instrumental to this conversation. So I really do thank you for that time. And I can assure you that I will be reaching out to continue having that dialogue and to actually get to action as you are asking for, and bringing the right people into the conversation to ensure that that happens. Over to you, Dr. Malinda Smith, an individual that I have Googled. Full disclosure, my sister works at Google, just so everyone knows, but impressive because, you know, being in your role and the responsibilities that you have taken on are not only the right thing, but fitting because of the work that you do. Really commendable, the work that you have done, and I look forward to hearing your comments as to the work that you do and a little bit about yourself. Over to you, Dr. Malinda.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging, just take the opportunity to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I hadn't planned on saying much about myself, but what I can say briefly is that I came to Canada in the late 80s. I grew up in what was originally British colonial Bahamas, where I attended high school and studied in the United States. Much of my research, undergraduate, master's, focus on subaltern, you could say subaltern studies broadly speaking, but I looked at the Indigenous peoples in Guatemala for my master's, and my PhD focused on Indigenous people in Nicaragua on the Atlantic coast. I also looked at the intersections of slavery and colonialism on Nicaragua's Atlantic coast in terms of the Garifuna peoples. And since coming to Canada to do my PhD, I have worked, I would say, all through my graduate program on issues of equity, anti-racism, and from an interlocking and intersectional perspective, and I've been part of the Researchers and Academics of Color for Equity, which is next year will be its 20th anniversary. So let me say, we are speaking in the context, as you noted, of global uprising around racism. It's not just the killing of in the United States, or the more recent killing of shootings of Jacob Blake, shot 7 times and then handcuffed to his hospital bed despite being paralyzed. I think what this raised is the kind of cruelty. Yes, it identifies certain kinds of inhumanity, but it also, I think, let me just stress this racism and the kind of wanton shooting of Black youth, of Black men and Black women, and the kind of degrading and dehumanizing treatment really draws our attention to the ways in which we have lost sight of the UN Declaration or of our Charter commitment to anti-racism, to not discriminating on the basis of color, race, national origin. I think since 9/11, these have been non-performative. And in fact, what we do, despite all of the statements, is we do discriminate on the basis of racism, of race, color, and national origin. So I think we need to actually attend to the ways in which we have shifted away from that. But I also think the context of this is we've had decades, since the 1960s, of acknowledging March 21st as International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. 3 decades, UN decades against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerances. We now in the UN decade for people of African descent. We have the UN DRIP. Despite all of this legislative framework, racism persists. Our focus is on the university, so I want to make a few points about that. You acknowledge the equity myth. And I want to say that since the beginning, visible or racialized minorities have been an equity-seeking group. So 30 years later, it seems to me a bit belated to be having statements about an institution's commitment to anti-racism. What that tells you, if they are only making statements now, is that racial equity has been non-existent. So we have an employment equity which excludes, and I want to stress, not marginalizes, excludes racial justice, excludes racial equity. So we've also seen statements unaccompanied by programs of action or resources dedicated to eradicating racism on campus, or expanding racialized faculty, staff, and students. So the second point I want to make is that we've had, despite 3 decades of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we have not seen a change in practice in terms of statements. So there's no accountability, there's no legislations to hold institutions accountable for that. And so in many ways, we see a situation of a dividing practice amongst equity-seeking groups in which gender equity stands in for all equity groups. As a feminist and an advocate of gender equity, this was never the original intent. So we don't have racial justice, we don't have disability justice, we don't have queer justice, and this is now, I should acknowledge that we are in Pride Week in Calgary, and we certainly almost always leave out persons with disabilities. So we need to have, as Dr. Zine pointed out, an intersectional or interlocking analysis. And that interlocking and intersectional analysis need to be attentive that racism is not singular. So we have been paying attention to anti-Black racism. We've been paying attention to COVID racism. We have to pay attention to Islamophobia, but also the ways in which religion has been racialized, particularly. And so it doesn't matter if you look Muslim, whether you're Sikh or whether you are Buddhist or whatever, you end up facing this. This is a deep systemic problem. And so the final point I want to say is we don't have a commitment to racism because we don't want it. When institutions want something, they do it. They dedicate institutional leadership and they dedicate resources. So we have that kind of commitment federally and at the level of institutions for gender justice. We don't have a parallel framework for racial justice. And there is, according to the title of this webinar, a fierce urgency of now, drawing on Martin Luther King's March on Washington. That urgency is now more than ever. And frankly, I think, hopefully something comes out of this. But I commend Professor Campbell for the anti-racism conference he's held and I had the pleasure of speaking at. So anyway, thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to a more fulsome conversation.
Dr. Smith, I have to use the word courageous again, because I think it really is about being comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations. And I think it really is about like being able to call out and information that's not available, or if it's not happening, to say, yes, it's great to hear the words, but where are the actions? Where is the backing to what we want to see? And oftentimes we'll see programs come into place, but that program doesn't satisfy the need of the country, especially at the federal level, and that's what I can speak to. So I know provinces and territories and municipalities and regions also have programs, but even at the federal level, as the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, I have seen pockets of money come out as to providing capacity. But when you see the need of the capacity and what that program and the funding offers, it doesn't match. And if it doesn't match, then are we going to be able to move that yardstick forward in the substantial way that I would say humanity is demanding right now? And if we are committed to that, we need to do it. So I actually really thank you, because as a federal government, we have a speech from the throne coming up in September. We will be making commitments, and we're having this conversation, and we see a diversity of perspectives when it comes to this conversation. But that's where I'm very comfortable with being uncomfortable in our conversations. And I appreciate you having the courage to call it out, because I want to make sure that this discussion is a substantial one. And so I want to turn it over back to Dr. Campbell, who has brought us together tonight, to make a couple of comments based on our opening comments, and then also to launch into the discussion. Dr. Campbell, over to you.
Thank you very much. There are 2 points I really would like to pick up on that our panelists have raised so far, which I think are really extremely important for us to always keep in mind. The first is that we tend to, as Jasmin said, we tend to think of racism as this monolithic thing, right? And so we have like an anti-racism committee, but really we need to be much more careful and much more precise in talking about racisms, right? The plural. Yes, of course, you know, anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism have elements in common and overlapping elements, but they are qualitatively very different things. And even beyond that, you know, Dr. Smith really made the point in an article I read recently, responding to some of the census data that was released, that even within individual groups, there are vast differences, right? So, you know, a Black person who's been born and raised in Mississauga, say, is going to have a very different experience of racism than a recent Somali immigrant who may be perceived as having a thick accent or whatever, right? And if that person is also an LGBTQ2S person, then there's another dimension of complexity there. You know, if they are neurodiverse, there's an added element of complexity there as well, right? So we really need to begin to think in much more precise terms about what we're talking about when we are speaking about individual racisms. The other point really that everyone has touched on that I'd really like to amplify is this notion of intersectionality, right? So my own research focuses very much on sort of on queer Caribbean subjects and their place within not just Caribbean society, but within the Caribbean diaspora throughout the world, including in Canada. And this is the question I think that really has played on my mind recently, and that really where a lot of my focus is right now, which is what happens to those people in these times who are already on the margins of their individual groups, right? We know, quite frankly, that in times like these, the dominant groups tend to intensify that marginalization rather than coming together as a group. You know what I mean? We get a lot of things like, look, the world is burning. Can't you see that? Like, we don't have time to deal with your niche issues right now. We've got this bigger conversation we need to have. And so those people get sort of pushed even more to the margins. And I really worry about that, right? We see women, LGBTQ2S citizens, trans people, the disabled, the neurodiverse, people with mental health issues. All of those who are already marginalized, they get pushed even more to the sidelines. And that is something that concerns me very deeply. And that's something, certainly in my own work, that I'm trying to make sure that we as an institution and myself personally don't enact that sort of continued and intensified marginalization. So thank you very much to all of you for really raising that question of intersectionality. It really needs to always, I think, remain at the heart of what we're doing. No one is one thing. We're all part of many, many different groups and many, many different identities that all need to be taken care of and addressed sort of very individually, right? So maybe I can begin then by posing a question to our panelists, and perhaps I can ask Dr. Smith to begin with this, as you were the last person who spoke. Just sort of considering your area of work, your area of activism, what do you see as the most, let's say the 2 or 3 most pressing barriers to you doing your work, but also to sort of reaching equity and enacting real decolonization? Like what are some of the major barriers?
One, I mean, so I'm going to focus primarily on the university, but I think that there are implications for the broader society, insofar as when I think about the university, I think about the broader community from which it recruits its students, for example, but the broader society from which it hires faculty and staff. And as we know in Canada, these are diverse. Calgary is Canada's 3rd most diverse city. So that matters to me, where it's pulling its students from. So we don't have academic pathways and pipelines for this diversity and complexity, right? So for me, that's one kind of thing, and that actually shapes everything from the student experience, the curriculum, to whether we have professors and teachers who are to teach and mentor them. And that also has implications for how we think about decolonization. For example, in terms of the curriculum, I often say even those people who claim to be post-colonial end up relying on colonial literatures. So that they're not engaging in indigenization, and they're not engaging in literatures from non-Western places. So you ask the question, can non-Western people think? So that kind of pathway and pipeline, complex thinking is just missing. But the second thing is, I launched the Diversity Gap Research, part of the Equity Myth and the Nuances of Blackness book that's coming out. And so data to me is huge. A major gap to ensuring equity among equity groups is having good data on each of the equity seeking groups, as well as these groups at the intersection. Right now we have good status of women data, we are developing gender identity and gender expression, but there's often a silence around collecting good disaggregated data on racialized peoples, and disaggregated to the sense that COVID-19 has amplified the need for this kind of data. And then the third thing I would say is leadership and political will. Now, I know you and I have written about this need for leadership diversity and asked the question, why don't we have it? And my view is, it's not just Canadian universities. Every major institution in Canada is marked by a lack of leadership diversity. Whether we say the Supreme Court, whether we say Parliament, whether we say corporate boards, whether we say nonprofit boards, whether we talk about the police, the judiciary, they are all, the media, all marked. So we get an overrepresentation of white Canadians and underrepresentation of racialized and Indigenous Canadians. That structural inequity is deep, and we need good data in order to highlight it. So I would say that a key barrier is that there is this absence of good, consistent, reliable data where we can actually have disaggregated information on racialized and Indigenous people. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that question of data is such a really important one, right? I mean, honestly, you go to any university in the country, almost any university, I'll say, just to cover myself, and ask them, you know, what percentage of your population is BIPOC? They won't have an answer for you, right? They will not know that, much as if you ask them how many are Indigenous, how many are Black, how many are this, right? I will point out that, I mean, certainly historically, the universities have been very averse to collecting that kind of data. I put in a grant a little while ago for to do a $500,000 grant to do a national survey of our universities, to do that kind of data gathering. And I'm pleased to say that seems to be a bit of a shift, because probably somewhere between 15 and 20 universities actually signed on to be a part of that if we get the grant, and to in fact contribute expertise and all of that. So it's good to see that shift in intention, but now yes, the follow through will be very, very important. Maybe Elder Jean, if I could talk to you, turn to you now at this point. What do you see as some of the biggest barriers to you performing your work?
So first of all, I just want to thank Dr. Smith and Dr. Zine for their remarks, and to say how important I think that both of their work is. In regard to the barriers, Dr. Smith actually already named the ones that I think are really critical. The data collection at the university I'm working in is something I'm happy to hear you're working on, Kofi, because it is something that I am also advocating for. And you know what astounds me is that we keep getting the same objections that we've gotten for decades. Oh, what about privacy? What about, well, you know, these are all, there are ways of coping with these things, and the reluctance to collect this data is quite alarming. I've been studying and working in post-secondary institutions for about 30 years. And, you know, while there's been some activity and the number of Indigenous and other equity-seeking groups has grown some in that time, it is the structural barriers that we are still facing. They haven't gone anywhere. We haven't dismantled them. And that goes into all kinds of practices in the university: hiring, curriculum change, representation of, as Dr. Smith made mention of, particularly in senior administration and governing bodies. We're lagging in the development of even the development of the implementation, promotion, and enforcement of anti-racism strategies. We just don't have them. And, you know, we keep getting told that we need to do some more consultation. And I think that, you know, whenever major sort of reactions happen, as are happening now, against racism, people are telling those in power, we've got the consultation, we've done that, we did it decades ago, let's get to work now. So I think that those are some of the most critical elements that we need to be addressing. Also, I just want to say, you know, that racism is deeply rooted in this country, and it is inextricably linked to colonization. And we're all impacted by both. No matter what our racial identity is, we are impacted, and it does manifest within each of us in some way. And for me, one of the most intractable barriers is the colonial mindset, which underpins the discriminatory policies and practices and supports the, rampant privilege of certain groups of people in the country.
Thank you. The question of consultation that you raised is such an important one that it's kind of a funny one, right? But not like funny, haha. Like all of these consultations that you almost begin to think that the whole point of them is really just to make you tired, too tired to get to actually do the work after it's all done, right? Like take another year and then do these things. To some degree, it is also very much indicative, I think, of the fact that often BIPOC people are not leading this work at these various institutions. We don't need to do those consultations. We've done them, as you say, Jean. We've done them for decades. We know what the issues are. We know what the problems are and how to begin to address them. If we were put into those leadership roles in doing this work, I think, yes, indeed, we would be able to start from a certain advanced point that we just don't at this particular moment in time. Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much for that. Jasmin, if I could turn to you now, what are some of the biggest barriers that you see to your work and then to sort of proper decolonization and anti-racism work?
Well, thank you to Dr. Smith and to Jean for their comments. I think I'm going to echo a lot of what they've said. And starting with the fact that our institutions are embedded in larger structures like neoliberalism, neo-imperialism, the legacies of white settler colonialism and Eurocentrism. And that's central to the decolonization project. So we need to keep that in mind as we start to develop a more granular analysis of the issues at different levels of the university. I think the first note I had made was one of the things that Malinda mentioned, and that was the lack of political will. And I think this takes us to what Minister Chagger has been saying quite a bit about the need for courage. And I think that there is an absence of political will for meaningful, radical changes that are needed. Not just window dressing, empty promises, slogans, hashtags. We need to see real, meaningful action. And I think that, as Malinda said it, I think, it's because they don't want that change. Because if institutions want something, we know that they will do it. So I think that's the question we need to call. First of all, is do you actually want this change? Because we don't simply want to be the ethnic racial props in this sort of scenario that is being staged. This is not a performative act for us. These are our lived experience. These are the experiences of our students and of the society around us. So we want to be able to address them. So we need more political will and courage to take our institutions further. I think the other thing I wanted to speak about, but everyone else has already talked about it and addressed it so eloquently, is the intersectionality. The fact that we need to really have broad-based equity concerns that address interlocking oppressions. So all equity-seeking groups should be represented. And I think that's very important because I have seen the development recently of policies that I think are trying to respond to a global condition and are focusing very narrowly around racism to the exclusion of the intersections and connections with other forms of oppression, whether it's disability, sexual orientation, religious discrimination, etc. All of the other issues need to be taken into account, because otherwise we end up with this sort of add and stir version of diversity, which we long abandoned in the 1980s, and it's very distressing to see those kinds of policies being shaped currently. And I think to that end, while I absolutely agree about the issue of consultation being that these are things we've known for decades, I do see it important to reach out to university stakeholders, because there's new groups of students that come in, there's a new generation coming in, and I hear it in my classrooms, they want to be heard. They have things to say. We are seeing student groups right now who are actually holding their universities to account for some of the issues around racism. They are organizing, they are writing reports, they are banding together, they are out there on social media calling out things that they're seeing in their institutions. And I think that's really important. And that is also because they want to be heard. And they don't feel that space in a lot of their classrooms. The racialized, marginalized students from various walks of life are not feeling that they are able to articulate that and are not being heard. So I do think that it is important to create a platform where they can actually be heard, and that we are able to then promise some meaningful change, not just an exercise in, you know, as Kofi said, you know, keeping everybody busy. You know, that is a kind of distraction politics that, you know, we've been there and done that. This other diversity light approach is problematic as well. I think diversity is not just a box to check off. We need to really see that anti-oppression approach, not just the diversity window dressing. So not lip service, but we need the leadership, you know, to be able to take that on. And I think also the question of representation, and I know that's already been discussed, but I think that's very important. Students need to be able to see people who look like them in positions of authority. We need to decenter the Eurocentric, you know, framework of higher education and allow those other ways of knowing and allow, you know, other experiences to be centered. You know, most marginalized students do not know what it is to be at the center of their educational experience. They're always on the margins. Moving from the margins to the center is a very powerful move and very rare in their experiences. And so I think that if we have more leadership that is representative of the diversity of our communities, that maybe there will be a way of introducing that real kind of shift that allows there to be a plural center within education, where we have a multi-centric approach, where there's diverse knowledges and experiences that share the center. And I think that that is something that requires that kind of representation to be there. And so I think those are the issues that I wanted to raise.
Thank you very much, Jasmin. The students, one of the really inspiring things about this time has been actually watching the students really realize and grow into their own power and use that power through collective action. I mean, they've accomplished some really amazing things across the entire country. It's really quite wild. And just to pick up very quickly as well on that question of will, right? The idea that if universities really wanted this change, that change would happen. And I think that what's really been interesting to me is watching actually faculty and staff and students at the university really come to that realization and come straight up against it, right? And what I see a lot of is actually people refusing to engage with their processes, refusing to engage with their institutions when they're not convinced that they're going to see that this is actually a quest for real change and not just a PR exercise. People saying, you know, we've been through this. We've wasted our energy before. We've banged our head against these walls. And now, unless you convince us that we are really going to get something out of this, something good, that you actually care about us and not just about ticking another box, as you say, right? Or looking good for the cameras. Until that happens, we're just not going to get involved. We're not going to waste our time yet again on something that's going to produce a report that's going to sit on someone's desk for a couple of months and then make its way to a filing cabinet in the basement somewhere, right? Like, there's no point in wasting our energy on that anymore. We will use it in the proper ways, kind of thing. Very interesting. Thank you very much. And I think I'll throw it back to Minister Chagger at this point. I'm sure there are some questions that have been coming in.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. This is what I've been waiting for. I've had a lot of opportunity to have these conversations, but to have the boldness of the conversation is, I think, what we need to do more of. And I think that's how we go. Data. I just want to comment a little bit on data. So I come with a background in science. In grade 6, I chose to go to the University of Waterloo to be in science because I went to a day with the difference. And there was a whole slew of women in front of me that were in fields of science. And needless to say, later on in life, I realized that none of them looked like me, but they were women and I was a girl, and we had that in common. But it definitely did steer my path into becoming a woman in science. And I think data is instrumental, and we need good data. And I think that's where Dr. Smith's comments were quite instrumental, because it needs to be good data, it needs to be reliable data, it needs to be national data, and it has to be open by default, because we have used data historically to perpetuate stereotypes and inequities. But if that data is available, then we can actually see all of that data to ensure that it is used for good and not evil, frankly speaking. And I think that's where good data is important. And we'll see that Statistics Canada is doing some of that work. For the first time, we saw the workforce data be shared. But I think on the flip side, I think it's also important to recognize and acknowledge that there are people who are not wanting to self-identify because our systems have held them back by identifying. And so I think that's something else that we need to address and actually call a spade and say, why would I share what I am? In 2015, when I ran to run for office, many people said to me, well, Bardish, you're going to have to change your name. There's no way your name is going to allow you to run, or don't put your face on a sign because people won't elect you. And I think these are some of the frank conversations that we need to have, because they are the realities. And I think that's where being comfortable with being uncomfortable is important in the conversations that we're having. But there is a reluctance, and I think that reluctance comes from at least 5, 6, 7 different sides. And I think when it comes to the teachings of the first people, 7 generations is a number that I also use often, is that we really need to look at where that comes from. But I like this conversation and the discussion that's taking place about youth and young people. These are people that have brought me into the fold to want to be a better member of parliament and a better representative. Their approach is very different than my generations and the generations that have come before me. They have not put blame on any individual. They've said, what can I do to change? I want a better environment. I will make better changes. I want you to know about better changes. I want more equity. I'm going to make changes in the spaces I occupy. How do I encourage you to do it? So they have been part of the solution. And something I've been saying to young people is, as we grow up, we build these boxes around ourselves. So let's not build those boxes. Well, you don't build those boxes. And we, as people who are a little bit older than yourselves, will also try to dismantle our boxes. So how have the youth that have taken up the work around anti-racism and decolonization, and what can we learn from their advocacy and their approach? I would love to know what your thoughts are on that. So I'm going to start with somebody who has worked a lot with youth. So Elder Jean Becker, I'm going to come to you because I know many young people often give your name to me to say that they know you. And then we'll go to Dr. Zine and then to Dr. Smith.
Thanks, Bardish. So, I really believe that youth are leaders in this work, and actually have always been so. I remember back in 1990 during the Oka crisis, elders were warning governments at that time to heed the dissatisfaction of Indigenous youth with the current conditions, with the status quo. And, our youth are the fastest growing population in Canada. We have the largest per capita youth population in the country. And our youth are, as has been said, they're standing up, they're taking a stand. You see in our local community right now, Indigenous youth who are taking a stand for land and for Indigenous rights in the community. And they're doing it, right here where we are. They're not focused on somewhere else. It's very immediate and I think that that's a lesson that we can all learn from as well. That we need to work where we are, and we need to work with the people that we are amongst. And what can we learn from them? I hope we can learn to listen and to respond with action, as opposed to, some more rhetoric, some more good words and then going away. We really, as has already been said, the time for action is now. And I think that every day shows us there's an absolute imperative to take action and to make it really responsive to the voice of our youth.
I'll tell you, like, as lawmakers, the legislation we pass impacts them for way longer than the decision makers at the table. And it's so instrumental that they be part of it. And I feel your heart in your words, and I admire the fact that even as an elder, you continue to embrace and learn and engage. And I really wish that was contagious and would spread across all of humanity. So my thanks to you for your words, Jean Becker. Dr. Zine.
Thank you. I think picking up from what Jean has said, social movements are often youth-led, and we've seen youth at the helm of Black Lives Matter, Idle No More campaigns, and globally we've seen youth front and center of fomenting change if we look at, for example, the Arab Spring. And so I think it's really important to look at how youth are leading in a lot of these directions that, you know, our generation maybe actually has to catch up with a little bit. I have found in my research among Muslim youth who are from diverse ethno-racial backgrounds that they are finding spaces of resistance to the various forms of marginality that they experience, and have been leveraging that through the arts a lot, in particular through film, theater, visual arts, photography, poetry, spoken word, and storytelling. And I think that that is a very powerful space. And in my book, I talk about it as a form of anti-colonial public pedagogy and the creation of a counter-subaltern space, the counter-public space. And so I think those are very generative spaces where there are productive tensions that are actually moving forward critical dialogues and allowing for the imagining of alternative futures, which I think are what youth are able to give us. Just as an example, at a university level, when I was teaching prior to my job at Laurier at University of Toronto and Mississauga campus, I actually got that sort of contract teaching job because the students at that university, the majority of them were students of color, of various racialized backgrounds. They formed an ad hoc diversification committee, and they surveyed all of the university's course offerings. They looked at who was teaching the courses, and they wrote to the university and said, I'm sorry, but all your offerings are very Eurocentric. They don't represent us. We don't see ourselves represented in this curriculum. And we want to see this, you know, list of courses that they had, and we want to see these people teaching them. And, you know, universities tend to be in that neoliberal way, a supply and demand type of thing. And so actually the university did bring in some courses for the first time, and this was in 2005, that a course was being taught on immigrant and refugee women, on post-colonial feminism. And then I came in to teach gender and Islam. And that was a direct result of student organizing. Right. And I thought it was really phenomenal. And the Muslim students that were part of that actually invited me and had a dinner because they'd never had a professor that looked like them, you know, and at least in the arts. Right. So it was a very important thing for them to be able to push the university to say that, you know, there is a lot more out there than just simply the Eurocentric world. And there's different bases of knowledge that we want to learn from. And they were very bold, you know, in saying that these are the kinds of courses we want. They did their research, they had their demands. And I see more and more students creating those calls to action and calling upon government institutions, on universities and other institutions to you know, make those changes, right? And to, you know, sort of not just fall back on lip service, but actually push them to action. And I think that they play an important role in holding, you know, the feet to the fire when it comes to institutional change. So that was an inspiring thing for me.
Dr. Zine, I really admire that, and I really appreciate it because it's so true. Just today in the Waterloo region, I had the Ahmadiyya youth, Muslim youth, who donated to the Waterloo Region Food Bank, and they had been reaching out to my office to say, we want to donate to your community. And when I spoke to one of the leaders in that community, I said, how many communities in Ontario have you donated to? And they said, you're the 53rd. And so these young people have been organizing food for different communities and saying, who needs this, just so we can feed them. And they're named Humanity First, and they have brought the best out of humanity. And I think that's when it comes to young people. And even in COVID, we've seen the return of the rise of anti-Asian racism. And it is, you know, Asian Canadians, the youth of Asian Canadians that have really stepped up to say, we're going to showcase the best of our community so that people see, who are your first responders? Who are these essential workers that are so instrumental right now? Who are these faces? And when people actually look at who is serving you and taking care of you, it does make you pause, because we're so, and I can't always tell if we're intentionally ignorant or genuinely ignorant. And I think that's where some of this is such an important conversation, because young people have become global citizens. They are aware of their neighbors. They are aware of their friends. They get into their backyards. And when they are demanding change, they're willing to change for that change. And they're asking for it now because they're part of it. They're not expecting somebody else to do it. They're saying, we don't mind giving a little bit more to make sure that our colleagues and our friends and our neighbors get ahead as well. And it's a fascinating thing. And I think if you actually peel back those layers and look at it, I really appreciate you for acknowledging that. And even when it comes to, like, you know, the whole concept of nothing for us without us. And if you can see it, you can be it. I never had a teacher that looked like me. I never really saw people at the front of the room that looked like me. And, you know, people said, well, you made it. Yes, but I never believed that I could. And it was because I had good people around me that had more courage and confidence in me than I did in myself. What I want for young people is for them to have that confidence in themselves, for them to see it, and for them to topple. So now when I see kids in my community, they say, you're the MP, I'm going to be the Prime Minister. And I love it because I want to help them become the Prime Minister. And I think that's why it's so instrumental that we be part of that foundation, and to lay a foundation that can never be undone, regardless of the government of the day, regardless of the leadership of the day, regardless of whatever else. And I think that's instrumentally what we are building right now. So I really do thank you for your comments. Once again, just like Elder Jean, you have hit my heart. Dr. Smith, over to you. I love your backdrop, by the way. I just want you to know.
Okay, Calgary, you're welcome. I think, so this is interesting. Young people have been actively engaged in social activism for time immemorial, often unacknowledged. And so I'm actually thinking about anti-racism. I'm thinking about, we got the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination because young people in then apartheid South Africa were marching in Sharpeville, and the police opened fire on them and killed 69 of them. But even more recently, when we think about, we got critical race theory and activism in universities because young people weren't happy with the curriculum in law schools. And since the university initially wouldn't agree to the courses, they organized alternative curriculum. And when those alternative curriculums were so successful, universities thought, well, we better incorporate them. And so now we see all these kind of public curriculums around all kinds of issues. But in a way, those actually, you could see those arising from young people engaged in critical race analysis. But it was Water for Life, whether it's Roads Must Fall to, or Why is My Curriculum So White? In universities, whether it's Fees Must Fall in Cape Town, South Africa, or Fees Must Fall in Quebec mobilization. These have been young people doing amazing work. Again, we're thinking about Black Lives Matter. We're thinking about Black and Indigenous youth mobilizing around racism, racial profiling, and carding, drawing attention to the ways in which these disproportionately impact Indigenous and Black youth. We think about the ways in which young queer people have been pushing against the stigma and the stereotypes and the kind of boundaries, and have actually been leading to more kind of gender diversity, gender inclusion. So I think we give young people, we don't give them their due. There's always this patronizing view about wait till you get older, you'll do differently. But the social justice movements in the broader society, as is the push for a more decolonial academy, is in large part driven by young people who are insisting they don't want just token representations in the classroom. They want representation that's a critical mass. The shift in the curriculum are not just saying we want additive content, a course here, a course there, a section in the curriculum. We want transformative curriculum. When you think about the young people, whether it's in South Africa or the young people in Tanzania, or the young people in Latin America, the indigenous youth here saying, we want indigenous content, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of seeing. It seems to me we are the better as institutions, universities, colleges, technical institutes, because of young people. So I actually think now, when you think about, I know it's controversial for many people, but all this discussions around statues and memorials is young people saying, why are the iconography, why are the classrooms, why are the buildings, why are the universities named after people who were colonial enslavers? Are they, how can you at one time talk about inclusion and at the same time, the symbols of the universities or that matter to us are exclusionary? I'm not saying there's a single answer to how we address these questions, but they are telling us they're not off the table. We ought to raise those questions, and they want better answers than simply don't do it. They want to know why, and they want to know, are there people we ought to be acknowledging, the anti-colonialists, the anti-slavers, that we are actually not paying attention to. So kudos to young people. They are amazing.
Dr. Smith, you hit my heart too. I hope my parents are watching tonight, because I remember growing up, my parents were always like, you ask too many questions. And I just wanted to know why. And it is just a matter of like, why? And it's not because we've always done it this way. And the way we have done it obviously isn't the way forward. And I'll tell you, as an elected member, that's one of my frustrations. And I often say the same 32 men that sat around the decision-making table to, discuss and negotiate confederation in our country, oftentimes are the same ones making the decisions today. And so how do you expect a different outcome? So the one thing I always ask is, well, who was at the decision-making table? Who was informing the decision-making table? Where did this idea come from? Because if you believe that doing it the exact same way is going to all of a sudden have a different outcome, well, that's a definition for something, and most people would say it's insanity. And I refuse to use my limited time here to do it the same old way. I will be changing the way we work, and I think that's where I lean on young people. And Prime Minister Trudeau, was a critic for youth and then became the Minister of Youth, and he had a really hard time letting go of that portfolio when he asked me to become the Minister of Youth. And I often say, like, why? But it's because the decisions we make impact them the greatest. And the way they want to do things, young people, is actually enabling change. They're not fearful of the way an outcome could be different. They're not reluctant. And I think that's where we need the courage of their convictions. The comment that you made about tokenism, I really admire that as well. And I really wish that we have more time tonight, which we don't. And I hope that Dr. Campbell brings us back together again and we find different opportunities. But even tokenism, there's many a times that I've been the first person at a table and people said, well, you're only there because of the color of your skin, or because you're a woman, or because you're young. But look at what I did at that table. And oftentimes when we got to other tables, people brought you there because of what you could do. So if you want to see me as a token, that's your prerogative. But what I see myself is as somebody who's doing work, and I'm going to try to bring people together to collaborate, to bring about a change that the country and the community needs and wants to see, not because I want it, but because we need it. And I also just think about the course in the University of Alberta when it came to Indigenous teachings taught by Indigenous for Canadians and for all people around the world. And it was a free course, and the subscription has been overdone. And I also just relate to like my work as a young person in the political process. And when I fought for same-sex marriages well before the Supreme Court ruled on it, when I fought for dying with dignity well before the Supreme Court ruled on it, when we fought for the legalization of cannabis, because substance use is a real issue that we need to address and talk about. Mental health is a real issue, and we need to be able to confront it and not be shied away by it or embarrassed by it. So I really do appreciate the fact that you're in this role of power and influence, and actually giving a shout out to not only the leaders of tomorrow, but the leaders of today. So I thank you for your comments and the beautiful landscape of Calgary that you have shared. Dr. Campbell, over to you.
Thank you. I'd really like to emphasize and to recall Jean's telling of the words of the Oka elders. Beware the youth, right? It's a message that I really want to put out there to my fellow administrators. Not be aware in the sense of afraid. Don't be afraid of them. I think listen to them, right? Engage them. Don't wait for them to come to you. Be proactive. Go to the youth and find them and listen to what they have to say. Because if you don't do that, then they will give you a reason to fear them. And we have seen that. We have seen that at both of our local institutions recently. And I don't mean to point the finger at any particular institution, right? We are all babies in doing this kind of work. And none of us is doing it well at the moment, right? We're all working our way towards it, but none of us is doing a great job. But honestly, speak to your students. They're the ones who make up the vast majority of the people on campus. They're the ones who can really, along with your other BIPOC faculty and staff, they're the ones who can tell you what's going on. So listen to them, engage them proactively, and above all, please believe them. Believe them when they tell you what they're experiencing. Believe them when they tell you what is happening in your institution. They know, they absolutely do know. We are running very much out of time, but there's one question that's that came in, and it's come in various forms so far, and I'd really like to throw it out to the three of you very, very quickly, just to hear your thoughts on it. And I'll sort of tack on an added question myself. The question is really something like, as for those people who live with privilege in our institutions, how can those grassroots university community members, how can they be good allies and help to influence change? I think it's a very important question. And I'll tack onto that as well, a question that came as well in various forms. You know, we've been trying to do this work for a very long time, and change has been hard and slow. How do we make administrators, how do we make the very senior levels of universities, how do we make them change? How do we make them listen? Maybe I can start with Malinda.
Well, you know, let me take us back to the 1984 Royal Commission on Equality and Employment, chaired by Rosalisa Monabella. What she argued is that change is not going to happen on its own, that it's self-perpetuating, and that if we wait and hope, which many universities leaders seem to be doing, it's not going to change on its own. So I actually think that this is why I think systemic racism requires a strong legislative push. It requires a strong attention to policies and processes, and it requires serious attention to the people making the decisions, so there's an accountability mechanism that they're accountable for. So we have all these kind of policies and processes. Nobody's accountable for them. Nobody actually monitors or checks to see the outcome, especially around race and racialization. So I actually think as long as you recognize that it's not going to change on its own, it needs intervention and it needs proactive measures, then we won't see the change we can believe in. But there was another, Liz Coleman, who was a former president of Bennington College, said, when it comes to change, universities, there's a kind of remarkable helplessness that they take on, as if they can't do anything. You have many people say this, they come up with all kinds of excuses. The energy to come up with excuses is the same energy you can come up with inventive arguments and answers. And I keep thinking, we have all these researchers in the world, the best institutions in Canada, and you mean you can't appoint serious researchers, invest in research to transform our institutions for the better? If there's a will, there's a way, and when there's a way, institutions put resources for transformation. Without it, it's just talk. So we actually need to do better, we can do better, and we should expect better. And it does call for courage, as Dr. Zine has pointed out.
Thank you. And the question of resources, again, is a really important one, right? Like, let's be clear. Universities have the resources to do this. They have the resources to put it in. If you're hiring this year, if you're hiring an administrator this year, you've got the resources to hire faculty of color. You've got the resources to hire an Indigenous senior administrator. You're doing it anyway, right? The resources are there. What is missing, as has been said throughout the night, is the will. Thank you very much for that, Malinda. Jasmin?
Thank you. I think I would agree with everything that you and Malinda have both said about change. I think going back to something you said earlier, Kofi, about the need to be proactive in institutions is important. A lot of time change is driven by grievances, by critical incidents, by things that happen, and then there's a sense of, okay, now we have to do something about it. So I think it is about being proactive and creating a culture, not just, you know, policies and documents, but actually what does it mean to change and shift the culture of an organization. And I think that's where the emphasis has to be, because it's about everything. It's not, you know, just about what are the statements that are made or the policies. It has to do with, you know, what is it like, what is the experience like being in there, what's represented on the walls, what's in the curriculum, what is who is teaching, who's in the boardroom, who are in charge. You know, all of these kinds of different layers of the everyday life and lived experience of the institution need to be taken into account, and not just when there's a crisis. That is when there is change, or where change has to be forced. So it goes back to the issues of political will, courage, and actually wanting to see that kind of change happen. Again, universities are neoliberal institutions, and I think that students actually have a lot more power than faculty do when it comes to pushing for those kinds of changes, because them, their families, and so on are the ones who are putting money into these institutions. And it's been great to see those activist communities begin to leverage that power in ways that is demanding and seeking that change. When it comes to allyship, I think, you know, what is important is that, you know, people who want to situate themselves as allies are not just there for the slogans and the empty gestures and this sort of thing, that it is about not, you know, performative. There's a lot of recently woke sentiment around race, which ends up being kind of empty and performative. And I think that in that space, there really needs to be a consciousness around what real change means, what power and privilege actually mean, not just acknowledging it, but working and leveraging your privilege in a way that will address and bring about that kind of change, and not the sort of what bell hooks talked about, learning off my back. It cannot be learning off the back of Black, Indigenous, people of color. You know, we are not there to cut ourselves and bleed on the floor for white people, right? It's about people taking responsibility for the privileges that they have, and understanding how their privilege also creates marginality and subordination for others. Understanding that relationality and acting upon it, and doing, you know, your homework. And there's lots of resources now out there about how to be an ally. And it isn't about taking up or claiming other people's voice and position. It's about, you know, working with and being invited into that kind of an allyship. And so I think there's lots of resources for people who want to take on that role. And I would encourage them to look at that. You know, a lot of those are put together by communities, marginalized communities, who are able to lay out what does it mean to actually work with us in solidarity.
And I really like that point you make about invitation as well. You know, one of the questions I often get asked, it's like, you know, I really tried to help. I really want to do something. And I went to this group, but you know, they didn't want my help, or I couldn't find a way in. And you know, and the answer to that is really just, as an ally, you just need to understand that, yeah, to some degree, you need to be invited into those spaces. And you need to understand that there are some spaces where you just won't be welcome, where the trauma is so deep, where people are not ready yet to have allies there, where it's a space that is a safe place for a certain group of people. And the fact that you're excluded from that doesn't mean, or rather, if the fact that you're excluded from that means that you're going to turn away from the work, then you were not an ally, right? Then you were never an ally to begin with. Thank you. Jean, if I could invite you to speak next.
So I often get this question from people. I get emails and people say, I want to help. What can I do? You know, I think what I just want to say to everybody is, it's not just youth who have power. It's not just students. It's all of us. And I just encourage, you know, if you're a staff person, no matter what your position in the institution is, and there's an issue at hand, speak up. Just make yourself speak up. Again, from Bardish, courage, you know, have the courage to actually advocate for, speak up for what you want to see, what you believe in. And as Jasmin talked about, you know, don't expect the people who are already overwhelmed with work to address these issues to do it on their own. Participate, and if enough people in the institution begin to speak up and begin to say, this is not okay with me, I think that change will happen, transformation will happen, but people have to have enough courage to actually get involved.
Oh, what great comments to end the night with. And it's so scary though, Elder Jean. When you speak up, sometimes there's things that happen that you just don't see, and all of a sudden you're shown the door, or you're asked to pack your boxes, or you're demoted, or you're not treated the same way, and you're not invited to the same conversations. And I think that's a reality of what people face. There was an individual had spoken, I was at an event, and they had shared that, you know, for the first 3 years of my employment, I just blended. And I blended to make sure that if they got rid of me, that I would be noticed that I was gone. And just saying it right now gives me goosebumps once again. And that's the reality of so many, is that if you get your foot in the door and you want to speak up because you know what you're true to, even within our own families, they'll say, listen, you got this job, it's a good job. Like, don't ruin this. Like, this is your time. And I think that's where it's a challenging conversation, but we do need to take the opportunity to speak up. And that's where I always find it fascinating when people say, you know, well, Bardish doesn't say anything and she just, you know, she's a puppet or whatever else. Well, then you don't know me. Any opportunity I have, I'm a good team player, but when I am having a debate and discussion, I do. And I remember my first conversation with Dr. Campbell. I feel like we became kindred spirits really quickly, but we went from like not knowing each other to saying, like, we're going to get some work done. And it's an individual who's one of the few cards that stay behind my desk at all times, and I'm still at the office right now. And anytime people are like, I need to talk to someone, I take a picture of his card and I send it their way to say, you need to talk to Dr. Campbell. So thank you so much for your comments, Elder Jean. And I really want to thank everyone for a really engaging and thoughtful discussion tonight. Thank you for sharing your insights, perspectives, and expertise. And I hope that you all who have been listening and engaging, it means so much that you've participated and been involved, that you found it to be a constructive conversation. From my perspective, I think that there's a lot of work and a lot of ideas that we can build upon. Systemic racism has always been one of the root causes of social and economic gaps for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The time for change is long overdue. And that's why if you look at the anti-racism strategy that was created by Indigenous people, by Black Canadians, by people of color. And it was the first time we actually went into community from coast to coast to coast. The first pillar, federal leadership, because we agree it will take leadership at every single level, including the federal government. The second pillar is in regards to actually investing in community, for community, by community. And the third pillar is changing attitudes in education and making sure raising awareness. And it's important that we do that. Right now, in this moment, with the realities of systemic racism at the forefront of national and global attention, we have the opportunity to do just that, bring about the change that each and every single one of us wants. But as Elder Jean alluded to, let's be aware of the burden on BIPOC faculty, members within our communities, and the burden that they are carrying. It is very challenging in this climate to wear certain shells and to have to carry that load and to speak for an entire gender or entire race. And I think it's important that we be aware of it. And as we begin to recover from the national and global impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, we can choose what our new normal is going to look like. We can choose to carry some of that load. And we can choose to become aware of who has been carrying that load for far too long. Like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said, we can decide that we are not going to be held back by the old ways of thinking. We can choose to move forward. We can choose to come back better and stronger. We can choose to build back even better and consciously inclusive. If we truly desire an inclusive Canada, every single one of us must step up, come together and do what we can to make our workplaces, communities, and public spaces safer and more inclusive for everyone. Although it won't happen overnight, it will happen. So let's do it, all of us together. I thank you so much for having me here tonight. Dr. Campbell, I thank you for bringing us together. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for participating tonight. Thank you very much to our audience members for being here for this important conversation. And thank you, Minister Chagger, as well, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. This is a conversation I think that it's clear could have gone on for another 2 hours very, very easily. And I always hate to cut these things short, but of course there are the realities of time to deal with. There were also many more questions than we were able to address. They were rolling in throughout and also before the event. So just so you're aware, we will be finding a way to continue this conversation online. We will answer some of those questions online, and certainly as soon as that's available, we will email a link out to the entire audience right now so that you can continue to hear our thoughts. If the panelists feel that they have further thoughts to contribute as well, we'll make sure they get those questions and are able to answer any of them that they feel they have something more to say on. So thank you very much for those questions as well. Earlier this afternoon, Minister Chagger and I were speaking, and she said, you know, I was looking at the panel and the work that they've done so far, and that really what we've done tonight is we've put together a panel of doers. And I think that if there's one good thing that we can take from these really, really terrible times is that I do have a lot of hope that in fact the times have made us now, we've moved into a time of doing. That I think I do feel that the time is right to strike, to make actual change, to make actual effective change. And I think if there's one message I would like us to close with, is that we take advantage of this time as much as possible, that we extend this time as much as possible, and that we take the terribleness of these times and turn them into something positive that will benefit us all in our institutions. Thank you all again very, very much for your time here today. I can't tell you, I can't put into words how much I appreciate your time in this conversation, really. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Kelly from the library just to close us out. But thank you all very much again for your time and for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Waterloo Public Library and Renison University College, I would like to thank all of the panelists for their insights and knowledge here tonight. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. Tonight's call to action is clear. We must, as individuals and organizations of learning and community, be resolute in addressing racism, taking action now to decolonize our systems and be held accountable for making change. For further reading resources to support doing the homework and doing your work, we've some relevant resources that are available to you at the library. Waterloo Public Library has a long-term partnership to offer monthly lectures. And we invite you to join us for these as well. The next event will take place on September 22nd and is a presentation about Gateway Family Program that brings non-residential host families and international students together to increase connections with students and their local communities. To find out more, we've added the link to our program guide and the chat section. We invite you to register on it. We thank you so much for joining this conversation, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.